Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event in the Touchstones of Democracy series. Welcome, Yuval and Jennifer. It's wonderful to have you here. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm the academic director and co-director of the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia. This is a series that we sponsor that looks at key moments, texts, people, and spaces in the history of democracy to better understand the democracy's present and future as well. So we're really delighted to have Yuval here today from American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for joining us. The format of the conversation, the format of the events are conversations. I'm just going to do a little introduction first, and then we'll hand it over to Jennifer and Yuval, who will be in conversation today. I just wanted to mention this is the last of our 3 events for this fall. We've had a great launch for the series. We'll be continuing it in the spring, so please do stay tuned. We'll have, looks like we'll have an event on Walt Whitman, one on Algeria and independence, and we have a conference on Tocqueville in April as well, celebrating the publication of Olivier Zunz's new biography of Alexis de Tocqueville. Also want to invite you, we'll be sharing a little information in the chat and at the end about a project called One Small Step, which we're pursuing at the Democracy Initiative, which brings people in conversation across the political divide. So please do join us for that project. We'll share some more information about that as well. I first want to introduce Jennifer, and then she'll be moderating the conversation. Jennifer is a professor at UVA in the French department, specialist on the 18th century, on Voltaire in particular. She has written a series of books about literary taste, including a book called Voltaire and the Temple of Bad Taste, her first work, and a more recent one called The Bad Taste of Others, which is discussions of literary taste in 18th century France, and has just completed a book called Rumors of Revolution in Louisiana, Song, Sentiment, and Sedition from the Enlightenment to the Age of Napoleon. So looking at the world of rumor and sentiment in Napoleonic and revolutionary era Louisiana. So we're really excited to have you here, Jennifer. You're kind of a perfect guide to walk us through this or to help us through this revolutionary era. The format will be that Jennifer and Yuval will be in conversation for about 30 minutes. We invite you to think of questions, of course. We'll be using the Q&A function. So about 30 minutes in, you can start sharing questions and we'll bring those into the conversation as we go, and we'll go till about 1:15. So thank you both for being here today. Thank you all for joining us virtually. We look forward to more conversations, and I'll hand it over to Jennifer now. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer Tsien. I'm happy to introduce Yuval Levin, who has a PhD from the Committee on Social Thought from the University of Chicago. He is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. He also happens to work with one of my best former students, Nicole Penn, who may be here today. In terms of journalism, he is the founding and current editor of National Affairs, senior editor of the New Atlantis, and a contributing editor to National Review. Dr. Levin served as a member of the White House domestic policy staff under President George W. Bush. He was also executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics and a congressional staffer at the member, committee, and leadership levels. And he has written a number of books, and the most recent includes A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. So welcome, Yuval Levin.
Thank you very much for having me, Jennifer. And I have to tell you, as you mentioned, we have in common a former student of yours, and she speaks about you in a way that any teacher must dream of. So it's really a thrill to talk to you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. I was thinking that we could start a little bit with just some background about your book. So we'll be talking about your book, The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of Right and Left. And before we get into ideology and the current right and left and things like that, I was wondering if, for those in the audience who haven't had a chance to read a lot of Burke, what would you like them to know about him? His background, his ideas?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that with Burke, it's actually very important to know a little bit about him to understand his thinking. It's enormously important, for example, that Burke was an Irishman in England at the end of the 18th century. I'll give you a basic biography. Edmund Burke, we think of him as an Irish-born English politician and writer. He was born in Dublin in 1730. And so he was of the generation of the American founders. His father was a lawyer in Dublin, a successful professional, but not a nobleman, not a person of the aristocracy. Very important about Burke is that his father was a Protestant and his mother was a Catholic. And that was very unusual in Ireland in the 18th century. It's unusual enough even now, but it was almost unheard of. And it meant that Burke grew up in a peculiar way in 18th century Dublin. We can talk a bit about that, but he ultimately was a very well-educated Irishman. He went to Trinity College in Dublin, and his father then sent him to London to study law. Burke went very eagerly to London, but had no intention of becoming a lawyer. He wanted to become a writer, and really to join the culture of the intellectual cafes of London, which just immediately became his world, his surroundings. At least as important as knowing of Burke as a politician, which he was for the last 30 years of his life, is to know that Burke was a writer and understood himself as a member of the literary culture of London at the end of the 18th century. Over time, he came closer to the political world. He became close with the Marquis of Rockingham, who was a leading figure in the Whig Party, the more reform-minded, less monarchist of the parties of English politics at that time. And in 1765, Rockingham arranged for Burke to get elected to Parliament from the city of Bristol, which was then the second largest city in Britain. He became a member of the House of Commons, and that was really his arena for the rest of his life. Burke lived until 1797, and he spent his final 30 years as a working politician who was also writing a lot about politics and culture and their intersection. This was a very contentious and eventful time in British politics. The period of the Regency crisis, the period of the American Revolution, of the French Revolution. It was really a time we think of now, though that was not clear then, when the meaning of partisan divisions in English politics changed from a party of parliament and a party of the crown to really two parties divided over how society should change. A more revolutionary party and a somewhat more reform-minded gradualist party that was a defender of the crown. And Burke was very engaged in all of these debates. He became particularly prominent in the debate over the French Revolution, but he was a prominent figure in everything about the Age of Revolutions in English politics. He's come down to us to this moment as a kind of father of modern conservatism, and there's some truth to that. But Burke was a Whig. He was not a Tory. He was a reformer. He was not a defender of the prerogatives of the monarch. He was an opponent of slavery. He was a reformer of English financial practices. He was very ambivalent about the emergence of empire, the notion that Britain should control India and vast North American holdings. And so Burke is a complicated figure, and I think to simply say that he became the father of the right is not to say enough about Burke, and he really has to be understood in the context of the late 18th century English politics, which is a very eventful, as I say, interesting, contentious context. And he really helped to give it definition. I mean, I would say Burke, more than almost anybody, helped people understand that what they were arguing about was how societies should change in the modern world, especially in response to the French Revolution, but with Burke, even decades before that. I guess that's where I'd start.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. I found that the book was remarkably well balanced, and I think you summarize the author's positions really faithfully and you give a really clear idea of their strengths and their weaknesses, both of them. So I thought I was very impressed by that. Since you work for a conservative institution, does that mean that you're on the Burke side rather than on the Paine side?
Well, I am a conservative, but I think it's impossible not to love the Paine side, especially for us in America. The American situation is somewhat different. Our conservatism tries to conserve the products of a revolution, and in a sense, the Burke-Paine debate as we can see it in America, but in some ways also even as it presented itself in Britain, because as I say, these were two Whigs arguing about the future, forced us to think really fundamentally about how social change ought to happen. And that is a place where Burke's views are more conservative. For all that he was a Whig, he was very worried about social order and about the possibility of the breakdown of order. He was not willing to take basic social peace for granted. I think that had a lot to do with growing up in Ireland in the 18th century, when it was perfectly evident that neighbor could turn against neighbor and that basic social peace was not something to take for granted. And so even in the times when Burke wanted change, when he wanted change in the role of the monarch in English politics, when he wanted to see the end of the slave trade, his arguments were always about how to enable change to happen in ways that would sustain some connection with existing traditions so as to preserve social order. And in that sense, he becomes a kind of father of modern conservatism, at least the Anglo-American version of it. And he's in a debate, at least by the end of his life, after the French Revolution, with Whig radicals, with people like Tom Paine, who wanted change because they thought that the status quo was utterly unjust, and that we now knew how to form a liberal society, a society that would treat its people equally or more equally, and that this required revolution, that ultimately it required the end of the monarchy, it required the end of the established church. Burke was adamantly opposed to those kinds of sharp breaks. And a lot of what ends up being the left-right divide, as it comes out of that debate at least, is about the question of whether change should happen through continuous, gradual, incremental change or through sharp breaks. And in some ways, that is still our debate about change, and about how we should welcome the future and how we should adapt.
So that doesn't mean that you're in favor of some of Burke's ideas. I mean, he has a lot of great ideas, but then, you know, hereditary
Yeah,
leadership.
look, Burke is an Englishman, right? And I'm not an Englishman. I'm certainly not in favor of that. I also think Burke is not nearly as friendly to democracy as a contemporary conservative ought to be. Burke is not hostile to democracy, not exactly, but he sees it as one. In the Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is really his most developed statement of his views, Burke argues that there are four establishments in British life that have to adapt but have to be preserved. And those four establishments are what he calls the democracy, the House of Commons, where he himself spent his adult life; the aristocracy, something like the lords and the noble families that provide a certain continuity and stability; the monarchy; and the established church. That's obviously a very English way of thinking about existing establishments, and an 18th century English way of thinking about them. I think that what's most valuable for us about what Burke has to offer is the mode of change that he prescribes, not the substance of social institutions that he's defending. And I think that view of how change ought to happen, which is to say, change has to be connected to people's experience of their own society. It has to flow from within, not be imposed from without. It has to be bottom up and not top down to the extent that it can be. That ultimately change can be destructive as well as constructive, is something that we have to keep in mind in a society that so values progress. We have to see that there is value in allowing people some continuity with their traditions and with their own past experience. I think Burke teaches that really profoundly well. He's unusually articulate about some of the concerns that a lot of people in the late 18th century had about what they were seeing in France or what they were hearing from the more radical sides of politics. Burke takes those vague sentiments and actually articulates them. In that sense, he's very useful to us. I don't think his connection to contemporary conservatism is genealogical. It's not that people read Burke and then they become conservative, but he gives voice to a set of ideas that arise almost unavoidably in a modern society. And he gives them a voice that is humane and that takes seriously both human flourishing and human suffering. And so I think he's an unusually useful exemplar of that way of thinking about society.
Oh, I'm glad you brought up the Britain-US divide, because Britain still doesn't have a written constitution, right?
Yeah, that's right. And you know, Burke was very ambivalent about America's written constitution. His defense of the English Constitution is that it allows for gradual change to happen in ways that can seem almost invisible. They can be so incremental that they're smooth. And for that reason, he valued there not being a strict written constitution. And when he talks about the English Constitution, he's really talking about the system, the way of life. Burke had some familiarity with the American Constitution. We know, for example, that he had the Federalist in his library. We assume he read it, or that we don't know. But what he has to say about it is very vague and modest. And in fact, Burke is very careful. I'll start here. Burke was obsessed with America. He cared about it enormously, and he knew a lot about it. And any American who would come to London, Burke would seek him out and try to learn something. But he's oddly silent about a few things. He's completely silent about the Declaration of Independence, which we literally know that he was present in Parliament when it was read to the members, and he never says a word about it. He said nothing about Thomas Jefferson, though he has a great deal to say about not only Washington and Adams and Hamilton, but far less prominent people. You know, he writes about Artemus Ward and people who we have to look up when we hear their names. Burke clearly knew a lot about Thomas Jefferson. He chose not to make him a prominent feature of his writings and thinking about America. He tried to understand the American Revolution in non-revolutionary terms. He ultimately supported the Americans, but he thought that what they were doing was made necessary by the mismanagement of Lord North's government. He thought that it was not revolutionary, but that it was protective of traditional ways of life. He liked the second half of the Declaration of Independence better than the first, I guess.
When you mentioned the two understandings of the word constitution, I was thinking that do you think that Burke understands constitution in the other sense, as you know, when you say I have a strong constitution, like your
Yes.
body?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly how he thinks about it. It's just the makeup of the regime. And so what he describes as the English Constitution is really those four establishments I mentioned, and common law jurisprudence, all of which are kind of gradualist and incremental. And he did not want to see those replaced with positive law, with a written constitution that strictly defined everything.
I wonder if, you know, if one thought in a Burkean way, you would think, you know, these 4-year presidential terms that we have and all these presidents, that would be the tradition. So according to him, we should follow this tradition because it's already established, right?
Yeah, you know, by now it's easy to be a conservative about the American system because it's been around for a long time. And we are preserving, however revolutionary it was to begin with, and I think it was, and I think the first half of the Declaration is a beautiful thing. It's America's greatest contribution to human civilization. But however you approach that, I think that at this point, American conservatives are conserving a liberal order and are conserving a constitutional system that can be defended both as positive law and as long established familiar tradition. And so it's a little bit easier to be a conservative in an established society, which of course Burke was too.
Yeah, and that brings me to the English Revolution, which I'll ask about a little bit later. But yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned the beauty of the document, because as a literary scholar, I'm very conscious of, I agree that some of these early American documents are just beautiful. The style is just amazing. It's part of their persuasive power.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, I have one question about the part of the book at the very beginning where you talk about the late 18th century as sort of the cradle of a lot of thinking. So the late 18th century as the era of the American and French revolutions. But this era was also the era of the Haitian Revolution. And then we have a Haitian revolutionary specialist here. So, and it wasn't just something that was happening on the side, because it did also help to shape US attitudes that exist now, right? I mean, we know about Thomas Jefferson's approval of the violence in France, and he witnessed some of the violence in France and he thought that was fine. But then when it came to Haiti, he was horrified, and you know, he cut off, you know, any ties to Haiti. So let's see, did you consider including Haiti in this age of revolutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's less it's a smaller part of what's evident to Burke about his thinking about his own circumstances. But I think it was actually a very large part of what's evident to Thomas Paine, the other subject of that book. And Paine was, unlike Jefferson, quite enthusiastic about the Haitian Revolution. Paine, of course, also differed from Jefferson about the question of slavery and more generally about questions of race. And I think that has everything to do with Jefferson's, I mean, this is obvious, but it had everything to do with Jefferson's attitude about what he saw happening in Haiti and why he couldn't connect it in his own mind to the excitement he had about the underlying ideology of the French Revolution. The question of race is much less prominent in Burke's thinking about his political situation, except in as much as he was an adamant opponent of the slave trade and an original signatory of the Wilberforce petition, which ultimately succeeded in ending Britain's role in the slave trade, but it took many, many years. At the beginning, there were only 8 or 9 members of parliament who were willing to sign that petition, and Burke was one of them. He always argued about it, though, in very broad kinds of philosophical and metaphysical terms. He never argued about it that I'm aware of in terms of race. I mean, I think he, like a lot of people, wanted to ignore the obvious black-white character of North American slavery. And he disapproved of slavery, but he did not extend that into a view of how Britain and other Europeans should think about race in general. Burke, as I mentioned, is very ambivalent about empire. He thought that the British were badly mistreating India already by the end of the 18th century, and was very concerned about the notion that British soldiers would be sent around the world to rule over other people, and then would come home and would bring that way of thinking about civil society to British life. He was quite skeptical. Really, in a lot of ways, he was skeptical of any blunt use of power. And that certainly extended to how he thought about British Empire. But there's not a lot in Burke about race as we would think of it now. Whether it's a subject that he didn't see or a subject that he chose to ignore, it's not a prominent part of what he has to say.
Mm. Okay, thanks. So speaking of Thomas Jefferson, who is our founder, I was wondering, I mean, well, I saw that your book had this very beautiful, like dialectical, simple structure at the beginning, and I think simplicity, like Paine, I think simplicity is really great because it helps you to think. So you do have a dialectical, like a dialectic between Paine and Burke, but how did you decide on those two as opposed to, let's say, Thomas Jefferson or Condorcet, Germain de Staël? How did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of ways that you could look at that period through this kind of dialectic. And in a sense, that's a core argument of the book, is that this is the period in which the core division in the lives of what would become the Western democracies changed from being a question about who should rule to being a question about how change should happen. It's very evident in British politics, where the division between Whigs and Tories in the generation before Burke is a division between monarchists and parliamentary and the party of parliament. In the generation after Burke, it's a division about the French Revolution. It's a division about whether change needs to happen through a break with tradition or whether tradition is the way to enable change. And Burke lived through the transformation of the party system into a debate about that. And he didn't just live through it. I mean, he really defined that transformation in a lot of ways. He helped define the party of gradual change. In that sense, I thought Burke would be a particularly interesting figure to think about that period through. The question of who to oppose Burke to is not an easy question. He was in conversation like this with a lot of people. And because the debate happened within his own party, within the Whigs, some of that conversation happens really in a fairly private way, with some very heated disagreements that you can find in Burke's correspondence and that you can find in other people's correspondence of the time, between him and Charles James Fox, between him and some of the other prominent politicians in his party. What stands out about the Burke-Paine debate is that it was a very public debate. Burke and Paine did know each other somewhat. They exchanged some private letters, I would say their private letters are surprisingly uninteresting. I mean, there isn't really much of substance to them, but they addressed each other publicly. Paine was in France for the key events of the revolution. He wrote to Burke. Some of those letters are interesting. And in some ways, what he wrote to Burke first got Burke worried about what was happening in France. Burke wrote the Reflections on the Revolution, which was a public essay trying to persuade the British to reject the French Revolution. And Paine then responds to that directly in maybe his greatest book, The Rights of Man, is a direct response to Burke's Reflections. It quotes the Reflections quite a lot. It's actually an extraordinarily careful reading of the Reflections. And Burke then responds to that in a long essay of his called The Appeal from the New to the Old Whigs, which was published in 1791. He directly answers Paine's Rights of Man. And so what you have is a real public debate about some very fundamental questions that were alive in that period. And that public debate, along with their private exchanges, just makes their disagreement really interesting. I mean, it allows you to dig into some of these questions in some just fascinating ways. I think there are a lot of those kinds of dialectical books that could be written about that period, where these differences came to be embodied in individuals before they were embodied in parties. And, you know, debates between individual men and women are just more interesting. I think there's actually a lot to be done with that kind of work about the late 18th century. And, you know, Burke and Paine, I have to say, they're also wonderful writers. And that makes it a lot easier to write an academic book about a debate between two people, is if you can just quote them and let readers appreciate what great English writing can look like.
I have yet another question about your choices. So I'm just very curious how you came to this structure. There were, for example, in the section, the chapter on the state of nature, I was surprised not to see a lot of the names of other writers who had also had that, you know, presented that topos of what is the state of nature. I mean, most notably Locke and Hobbes, but then also Montesquieu, Rousseau, Laclos, a lot of others. So I was wondering if you didn't mention them just to not muddy the waters.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say I've got a book for you. This book began as my dissertation at the University of Chicago, and that discussion in my dissertation is very immersed in other people's writing, certainly in Locke and Hobbes, but I actually think that Rousseau's approach to the state of nature was incredibly influential. Rousseau in general influenced Burke in ways that Burke is reticent to acknowledge, but Burke read Rousseau very carefully and in a lot of ways was shaped by his psychology and his way of thinking about society. And so in that original, more academic version of this, which is also a study of Burke and Paine, I certainly do look to the roots of the arguments they make, and not only to the roots, but to the differences. You know, Burke rejects Locke's familiar state of nature theory in a very profound way. He thinks that to try to understand the human person by thinking about men and women outside of society is a fundamental error, because there are no men and women outside of society. And so you can't really understand them in a condition in which human beings have never existed. And so his political thinking begins in society. He says there is only the social man. There is no pre-social man. And that means that the roots of his principles of politics are very different from those of Locke. Burke is very careful about this because he is a Whig, and Locke was a kind of, I mean, you know, Locke was much more influential among the English Whigs than he was even among the American founders. We sort of associate Jefferson with Locke now. Jefferson didn't really have a lot to say about Locke, actually. But Locke was a very important figure in the milieu that Burke was living in and working in, and yet Burke completely disagreed with him about fundamental political questions. And so there is a kind of careful dialectic there between Burke and Locke. Paine, in some ways, Paine offers a Lockean vision, but one that I think is much more sophisticated and that actually tries to deal with some of the challenges that had arisen over 100 and more years to Locke's way of thinking about the state of nature. So it's impossible to understand these without some rootedness in those earlier debates. But I'll tell you frankly, this was an attempt to turn a PhD dissertation into a commercial book. And the editor I had said, you know, you can't just have the entire history of political thought here, and I guess I took her advice, and maybe it's a good thing I did, maybe it's not.
No, I think it's definitely a good idea, because I realized after hearing your answer that I was approaching this from an academic point of view, full of citations and footnotes and things like that. But your approach, I mean, not to throw shade on the academics present, but but I think your approach is just so much more clear and direct, which means that first of all, it's much easier to, I mean, you can get through the book with some, it's fun to read, like, whereas some academic books are real slogs.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you do lose something without question, and it's important that those roots be there so that these arguments are rooted in an actual study of their foundations. I don't think you can understand any political thinker in isolation. But as you say, for the sake of the reader, sometimes it's important to just put the questions out front without all of the scaffolding.
Yeah, and this way it'll reach a lot more people, which is really great. I mean, the idea of a public intellectual is so much, I mean, it's just so useful, and I did think I thought I saw the ghost of Rousseau in there. I definitely, I'm glad to.
There's a lot of Rousseau and Burke. That is, so when you, the only things Burke has to say about Rousseau in his public writings are negative. They're all negative, and they're only really in the writings of the 1790s after the French Revolution, where he attributes some of the radicalism of the revolutionaries to their reading of Rousseau. But you can find Burke in his private letters and even in some reviews in the Annual Review, which he wrote for many years in the 1760s, enormously impressed with Rousseau, especially with the Emile, which was really one of his favorite books. The Emile is Rousseau's work on education. It's a kind of novelistic work of social philosophy, really extraordinary book. And it actually had a lot of influence on Burke in the way that it did on the Scottish Enlightenment, on Hume, and in lesser ways on Smith too. It helped him to think about human sentiments as an essential piece of the puzzle of human political and social life. And I actually think he owes a lot to Rousseau.
Excellent, yeah. Let's see. Before we go to the audience questions, I think there's an elephant in the room, and I have to address it. So this book was published in 2014, and so much has happened since then, right? So do you think Trumpism is a continuation of the Burke Republican Party line, or do you think he breaks with the norms and there breaks with tradition, therefore it's anti-Burkean?
Yeah, well, I think it's very much a break. I've never been shy about Donald Trump. I'm not a fan, and I think that he, there is a strand, a tradition on the American right on which Trump does pull. I mean, a tradition of populism that has long been part of the right, and in a different way, it's been part of the left as well. I think that tradition is in tension with conservatism, that it's fundamentally anti-institutional and anti-traditional. And Trump really brought that to the surface. I mean, Trump made arguments that were basically a way of turning voters against America's core institutions, of undermining trust, and making the case that ultimately no one should have any confidence or trust in our existing systems and structures. It's not hard to see how that's not a conservative argument. Obviously, it's a complicated picture. I mean, I think the contemporary American right sees itself as the outside party in American life in a way that makes certain kinds of populism very appealing. I think that there can be constructive versions of that, but Trump is the absolute epitome of the destructive version of that and of the danger of populist politics. And the objections I have to Trump are kind of rooted in a Burkeanism. I mean, and so I certainly see him as in tension and in opposition with that side of the American right, not as an extension of it.
Okay, great. Laurent suggests that we take some audience questions. So here, I'm not sure whether you can see them, Yuval.
I probably could if I was just a little bit better at this, but
I can.
Oh, I can't see them actually. Yes.
Okay, you cannot.
I can.
Okay. Would you like to choose one? For example, the second one, Henry McHenry.
Sure. So I suppose everybody can see that. I mean, the question is, given the decline of religious participation, the absence of a national service project, intense polarization of the political space, the ascendancy of identity politics, is there any infrastructure for common ground left? What would Burke think of the hundreds of grassroots attempts to restore the possibility of fruitful dialogue among us, like Braver Angels, Listen First? Yeah, thank you. I love that question. And I think it's a very important question in this moment. These are efforts that that I'm personally involved in and that I think are enormously important to the future of our society. And it's hard to say exactly what Burke would think of them. I think a lot of them represent attempts at a kind of bottom-up institution building, rooted in civil society, rooted in some of the traditions of our various communities, that offer us ways of bringing people together in a divided time. I think the question for American political life now is, how do we come together? How do we overcome the divisions that now characterize American political and social life, the intense polarization? I think that's the question we have to ask of our constitutional system, of the party system. It's a question we have to ask of American federalism, of American civil society. And a lot of these institutions now are exacerbating our divisions rather than mitigating them. And we have to think about ways of reforming these institutions, again, the party system, the electoral system, reforming them, not fundamentally transforming them. And I think a lot of these reforms can happen within the boundaries of the Constitution, can happen in ways that involve changing the rules without rewriting our fundamental charters. But we have to see this as our purpose, as the problem to be solved. And I think in a way, that's the first and foremost challenge. And there, I think Burke has a lot to offer us. Burke was very concerned about social peace. And part of his concern about what he saw as the radicalism of the French Revolution, for example, was a sense that these were people taking social stability and peace for granted and thinking that you could just change everything and not run the risk of breakdown. One of the reasons Burke came to be thought of as a kind of prophet of the decline of the French Revolution was that he warned of political violence from day one. In a time when a lot of people in Britain were very excited about the French Revolution, Burke said this is going to end in violence. And when it did, it looked a lot like what he had seen coming. And I think that instinct, that insight, that sense that stability and peace in a complex modern society are very hard to sustain, are very precious things that we ought not take for granted. I think that's a little bit more obvious to us now in the wake of the last few years, but that it's probably still not obvious enough. And that when we think about how to bridge differences, we have to think about how to sustain social peace and stability. And on that front, looking for equipoise, looking for balance, Burke can be enormously useful. I would also say, not to go on too long, but I think the solution to the problem, the answer to the question of Burke's seeming self-contradiction actually has a lot to do with that emphasis on social peace. So Burke is a friend to the American Revolution, though, as I say, he's careful not to call it a revolution. He's a reformer of English institutions. And yet, when the French Revolution happens, he becomes almost a kind of European-style conservative, continental-style conservative, defending the monarchy, defending the church, defending social order. And I think the key to that, which you can find, I mean, he makes it very explicit in the Reflections on the French Revolution, the key to that is his concern for stability and for equipoise. He thinks that there are times when societies lean too far in one direction, and you've got to lean against them in the other direction. Sometimes that's too far in the direction of individualism and a breakdown of authority. Sometimes it's too far in the direction of authority. And constriction and centralization. And I think that's a very important insight for our own time, because American society in the last several generations has gone from a society that feels itself too constricted and conformist and in need of the liberation of the individual to, I think, increasingly a society that sees itself as too individualistic and isolated and lonely and in need of something like social solidarity. I actually think those two impulses serve the same good end. They both argue for what's a kind of balance that's needed for human beings to flourish. But as a practical matter, they push in opposite directions. And it's important to see that sometimes that's not a contradiction. That's just what it takes to sustain a free society. Burke does teach that lesson for this moment.
I wonder if the class of civil servants is actually like playing the role of what Burke thought the nobility should play, just as a kind of, holding.
That's
making
very
things-
interesting. I mean, I think there is something to that. There's also a way, and Burke kind of hints at this himself, Tocqueville does too, that there's a role for certain key professions in the life of an increasingly liberal society that's a little bit like that kind of aristocratic role too. The professions of the lawyer, for example, even the physician, that just offer a certain kind of established stability that can be trusted. And the reasons they're trusted has to do with limitations they put on themselves and with kind of obligations they feel. Obviously, that requires a kind of idealized view of the aristocracy. And sometimes Burke had an idealized view of the aristocracy, sometimes he didn't. But I think that if what you value about it, which is what he valued about it, was its capacity to stabilize, there are certain kinds of professions and institutions in American life that tend to play that role, even though we don't really have at least a formal aristocracy.
Thank you. There's a very interesting question by Robert Brunner. It says, you write that Burke opposed revolution as a means of political change. In business life, revolution is more or less constant, as Schumpeter and others have argued, yet many business leaders would describe themselves as conservatives, even as Burkeans. To what extent would Burke have embraced economic change, even if it is revolutionary?
That is a great question, and it's a complex question. I would say it's particularly complicated for us by the fact that Burke died in 1797, and that means that he got to see part of what we would think of as the kind of emergence of capitalism, but he did not get to see industrial capitalism. Burke in his lifetime was a friend of the market economy. He was literally a friend of Adam Smith. They knew each other quite well, and Burke learned a lot from Smith. More, I would say, from the theory of moral sentiments than from his economics, but nonetheless. And to the extent that Burke writes about economics, it's in a way that is quite friendly to market competition, that's quite skeptical of what we would think of now as government regulation. One of the last things he wrote, a little sort of really a memo to the prime minister, to William Pitt, that we now know as the Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, is something like an argument against wage protection for agricultural workers. And it's a very capitalist piece of writing. I do think, though, that if Burke, and this may be even true of Adam Smith, who died in 1790, if Burke had seen urban industrial poverty, he might have thought a little bit differently about the market economy. Burke did not get to see what really became the face of capitalism by the middle of the 19th century, densely packed urban industrialism. And I think that this is a contested question, I should say, among Burke scholars, and there's some very interesting work on Burke's economic views. Gregory Collins at Yale, just last year, wrote a really wonderful book on this question. My sense is that Burke would have responded to, say, the London of Charles Dickens, which, may be a little exaggerated, but Dickens really lived in that London, and so did his readers. He didn't make it up. Where you find people who have been forced by economic pressures to move from the farm to the city, to work in factories, and in conditions that had really never before been seen in the human experience of densely packed urban poverty, city poverty. I think if Burke had seen London in the 1840s, if he had seen Bristol, which he knew well, in the 1850s, there was a lot about it that he would have been horrified by. And a lot of it has to do with the revolutionary character of it, or you might say just the breakdown of social life, the disruption that it involved. I don't think that it would have made him a Marxist, but I think that it would have made him a kind of romantic skeptic of capitalism. And in fact, the romantic skeptics of capitalism in the 19th century drew a lot on Burke and had a lot to say about Burke. And so that's a long way of saying we don't really know the answer to that question because Burke never saw truly modern capitalism. But my sense is that he would not have been a Schumpeterian, that creative destruction is not a phrase that really speaks to Burke's disposition. And we know he was not a libertarian, that he was not an individualist. Burke is a very communitarian conservative and ultimately thinks that people's obligations are more important than their rights. And so I think he would have been he would have had a complicated relationship to late 19th and 20th century conservative entanglement with capitalism. He wouldn't have been an enemy of capitalism, but I think he would have been a kind of, the early neoconservatives in the 1970s. Irving Kristol wrote a book called 2 Cheers for Capitalism. I can imagine Burke writing a book called 1.5 Cheers for Capitalism for these reasons.
Yeah, and in the 18th century, they hadn't experienced that much real capitalism, right? I mean, there were a few things here and there, but a lot of the French Enlightenment people were in favor of capitalism, but they were very idealistic about it, except for Rousseau. Rousseau was against it, but he was.
Yeah, you find this in Paine too. Paine is a real fan of Adam Smith's economic work. He saw it as liberating, right? He fundamentally thought about it as enabling the individual to have more control over his own life. And it is that, we should say. I mean, capitalism did, in fact, enable a lot of social revolution that was liberating for a lot of people. But I think people at the end of the 18th century, and Paine lived to 1809, so also didn't really see a lot of this, could not quite imagine industrialism. That's nowhere in Adam Smith. It's not in the imagination of Edmund Burke. And I think that the social effects of it, which were really what people were reacting to by the middle of the 19th century, just were not apparent to them. And it's very hard for us to know how they would have reacted to them if they'd seen them.
We have a couple of questions about the ordinary citizen. So Nan Ottenritter writes, how can Burke be useful to the ordinary citizen today who is in despair about our democracy? And then Thomas Little has a more specific question about a world in which social media amplifies the extreme voices of the people. He says, the Burkean dilemma is as relevant today as it was 2 centuries ago, but is it realistic to expect policymakers to vote against their own electoral self-interest in a world where social media amplifies the extreme voices of the people?
Yeah, these are both wonderful questions. I think that, well, first of all, on the question of what Burke might have to offer the kind of everyday citizen, I think there's an enormous amount. And in some ways, what Burke calls for is lower expectations of political life, but higher standards at the same time. That is, not to imagine that politics can be simply the instantiation of philosophical ideals, that it can just be theory and practice, and yet to demand that politics answers to a society's highest ideals. And I do think that that means a commitment to those ideals, a sense of your own history, of what it offers, but a sense of history that takes the good with the bad, that understands society as a kind of living organism, and therefore as connected to both its past achievements and its past sins in every moment. I think that's a view, that's a set of insights that has a lot to offer some of our contemporary debates. And Burke ultimately argues for, maybe I can put it this way, the metaphors in Burke's political writing are all about space. They are not about motion in the way that the metaphors of a lot of the Whig radicals of the 18th century would have been. He doesn't think of politics as taking us somewhere. He thinks of the purpose of politics as sustaining a space in which people can build flourishing lives. Now, sometimes that requires change, right? That requires reform and even dramatic change. But the purpose of it is not to substitute for individual change, for individual reformation. And ultimately, social revolution can't stand in for individual moral improvement. Burke thinks that that's how societies get better, is through individual moral improvement. And one other thing on this front is that Burke begins from a fairly low view of human nature, or you might say a Christian view of human nature, a sense that the human person is fallen and broken and prone to vice and to sin, and yet that person can be formed to be something better than that, can be formed into a dignified moral human person. That formation is done by our institutions, from the family and the community and religion and education, all the way up through a society's political institutions. This is why Burke has such an emphasis on sustaining the institutions that succeed. He thinks the formation of broken persons is very hard. And those institutions that have done it over time are ones that we should treasure and value. This is the sense in which he's a conservative. He wants to conserve what has enabled people to flourish in your own society. And I do think that that kind of case that begins from an appreciation of why we need formative social institutions, the church, the university, the family, the political culture, is enormously important to us now. We live in a very anti-institutional moment in American life. On the left and on the right, in different ways, you find people who are fundamentally hostile to what it is that institutions do in our society. And I think Burke can really help us learn a little bit about what institutions do. And in that sense, he can be a kind of argument against despair. And really, I would urge you against despair. I mean, I think that this is not, we should not overestimate the darkness and the difficulties that we confront now in our society. They're very real, but a society like ours in every generation confronts very serious difficulties. We have to see our strengths as well as our weaknesses. We have to think about the future, which our politics does not do nearly enough of now. And, I think that our approach to our political life has to be grounded in hope, not in optimism, not in the simple expectation that things will get better, but in hope, in the sense that they could get better if we work at it. And I think we have a lot to work with in this society to achieve that kind of positive change. And I do think Burke has something to teach us on that front, at least.
We have a question by John Owen. He says, did the French Revolution change Burke, or at least his opinions about important questions about politics? If so, was that change a conservative change, very meta question, on Burke's own terms, or was it an abrupt revolutionary change? If Burke didn't change, why did Paine and other Whigs think that he did?
Yeah, I'm gonna give you an answer, but first I want to say that this question is very contentious among Burke scholars, and that people who know a lot about Burke, surely a lot more than I do, are on different sides of this question. It's the question of whether Burke transformed from a Whig to a Tory, in a sense, from a reformer who believed in the need for dramatic change in English institutions, for greater democratization, for greater accountability, which is certainly what Burke is arguing for in the 1760s and 70s, into someone who just defends the status quo. I think that if you actually look at the arguments that Burke makes in the 60s and 70s, they are very much of a piece with the arguments he makes in the wake of the French Revolution. What changes is his sense of the dangers that confront British society. And when he first enters politics in the mid-1760s, his sense is that the gravest dangers have to do with the possibility of a loss of public confidence that results from basically abuses of power, especially by the king, who is getting more and more involved in politics in the 1760s and 70s. Burke was adamantly opposed to this and argued for Parliament acting firmly to keep the king out of everyday politics. They failed in doing that, and George III was very engaged and involved in politics in ways that Burke never came to approve of. And so you find him as a reformer in those years, without question. The French Revolution suggested to Burke that there was also a danger from a very different sort of threat, and that threat looked more like radicalism, looked more like a sense that that political ideas would be imported directly into politics by a kind of almost literary class of politicians, certainly in France, but he saw a lot of this happening in Britain too, and worried that the radicalism that would result from that, the break with the past, would unleash political violence of the worst sort. Burke was always most concerned about political violence, about the potential for the breakdown of social order. He had seen it happen in Ireland. He had seen it happen in London. The Lord Gordon riots, which were basically anti-Catholic riots, and which Burke saw very close up, led him to worry in the 1770s into the 80s about the danger of a loss of social order. And that certainly leads him to emphasize the need for stability, for for the defense of the established institutions. But Burke always argues that change should happen in incremental ways and that social order should be a primary concern of the statesman. So I guess I would argue what changed were the circumstances that he found himself in. And there's a very powerful image at the very end of the Reflections on the Revolution. Burke describes himself as a man on a ship in a storm who's running from one side to the other to keep the ship from leaning too far in either direction. And he's working to maintain, he says, equipoise. Equipoise is the last word of the Reflections on the Revolution in France. I think that's the way to understand some of the changing emphases and changing arguments that he makes between the 1770s and the end of the 80s. I'm sure that doesn't explain everything, and I'm sure that his experience of the debates about France also changed his mind about some things and about some of his friends and fellow partisans. But fundamentally, I do think Burke is always the gradual reformer, and in both cases is making that kind of argument.
Staying in the 18th century, Jeffrey Tyler Sick wants to know a little bit more about the influences on Burke's thought and how they're different from people more like Paine, which is actually some of the same influences, aren't they?
Yeah, in some ways they really are. I mean, I think that it's important to see that the debate that we're describing in different ways here, in that moment, occurred as a kind of debate among Whigs. And the political culture, the intellectual culture, more importantly, that Burke is living in, is very similar to the one that formed Paine, that formed Thomas Jefferson. The readings they're immersed in, the ideas they're thinking through are very similar ideas. I do think Burke took them a little differently. Burke has a complicated relationship with the English Revolution of 1788. He's a Whig, and so he really takes his bearings from, of 1688. He really takes his bearings from the Glorious Revolution, and yet he wants to describe that revolution in terms that are fundamentally, we would say now, conservative. It's important to say Burke doesn't have the term conservative. He never uses that word, but he wants to describe the Glorious Revolution as a revolution averted, and that is his term. Where what the Whigs did in that moment was to avoid a much more radical transformation of the English political tradition, to avoid a fall into republicanism, the end of the monarchy. They literally went to Holland, found a relative of the old English line, and brought her back and put her in power to stabilize their connection to British traditions. He has a very traditionalist view of what the Glorious Revolution really was. And he also tells a story, this is especially true in the Reflections on the Revolution, of English society as fundamentally stable and as understanding itself as defined by stability. It's really important to see that this picture is not strictly accurate, right? The period he's describing is a period in which the British executed a monarch, it removed another monarch. It's a period of tremendous political violence and a great deal of disorder. And Burke wants to describe it instead as a time when the British managed to avoid the collapse of political order. And so he always understands himself as advancing a sense of the Whig tradition that is rooted in incrementalism and gradualism for the sake of social peace. This is not how every Whig understood the tradition. And it ultimately, of course, becomes the Tory view. It wasn't the Tory view in his time, but it's what becomes the Conservative Party in Britain. By the time Disraeli is in power, he's looking to Burke as a model, even though Burke was a Whig. And so that's one way of thinking about his immersion tradition. The other is to see that Burke is not only immersed in a political tradition, but in a literary tradition. Burke's a writer. I think, frankly, throughout his life, if you asked him what he really was, even after 30 years in Parliament, he would be more inclined to think of himself as a writer than as a politician. And what really drew him to London was the writing culture, the literary culture. And I think that Burke is very deeply shaped by the literary currents of 18th century London. He also read a lot of French political and literary writings in that time. And it has a lot of influence over his way of thinking about the kinds of challenges that he ends up dealing with. Burke has, I think, a very sophisticated kind of social psychology. He's very concerned with aesthetics in the deepest sense. I mean, the only book he ever wrote really was a work of aesthetics, which argues about the way in which the way in which our ideas of the sublime shape our political thinking. It's also really about social peace. It's about avoiding violence, but in a non-political way, really, most fundamentally. And so I think Burke has to be understood in the context of 18th century high culture. And he's almost a kind of ambassador of that literary culture to British politics in the years in which he is in Parliament. He's valued for being a great writer. That's part of why the leaders of the Whigs kept him around. But more than that, I think he was a reader. He was a person who really sort of took in the culture of literary London and tried to apply it to the politics of his time. Samuel Johnson is like this too. Burke and Johnson were quite close. They were good friends. And I think that's something like the model that Burke had in mind for himself. And so it is very important to understand him in light of those influences.
Sam Quarterman asks, when you trace the intellectual history of some components of the alt-right, in particular neo-reactionaries like Curtis Yarvin, it's clear that they're drawing on the monarchical, stability-seeking components of Burke's theory and other Whig writers, and combining it with a distrust of intellectual authorities and a distrust of the Democrats. Could you speak to the relationship of the alt-right to broader conservative political thought? Is this just what happens when you take the idea of a gradual change out of Burke? Or is this more of a case of trying to apply substantive Whig politics to the modern context?
Yeah, I think that there is an element of genuine reactionism in these ideas, which isn't really quite in Burke. These are rooted more in a continental European throne and altar conservatism. And Burke really is not friendly to those traditions. He wouldn't have been a conservative in France in his own day, because he is fundamentally a Whig, and that does run deep for him. That is, he is a believer in what ultimately becomes a kind of democratic ethos. Burke has concerns about absolute democracy. He's an opponent of republicanism. He wants to sustain the monarchy because he thinks democracy can become oppressive. And wants there to be a kind of layering in society that allows the excesses of each of the institutions to be tempered by the other institutions. But he's not a throne and altar, de Maistre sort of conservative. And I think that element is more evident in today's neo-reactionism, which is a view that completely rejects democracy and that really seeks ultimately hierarchy as a way of understanding the proper arrangement of a human society. I certainly think that there is also just a traditionalism in these views, and Burke is certainly a traditionalist. But the question actually gets at an important piece of what I would argue is the answer here, which is that Burke is an incrementalist and is a believer in finding the best in the existing social order and drawing out of it something that can be used to address the worst of the existing social order. That's not how that kind of reactionism, that kind of alt-right view thinks today. And so I don't think Burke would have identified with it, but that's not to say that it finds nothing in his kind of resistance to change, frankly, to draw on. I think that kind of reactionism is poisonous to the idea of conservatism that I think of as the essence of Anglo-American conservatism, which is rooted in an ideal of the human person that is fundamentally democratic in the best sense, that takes seriously the opening of the Declaration of Independence and does believe that we are all created equal and that ultimately that should be the essential principle of our politics. American conservatism, as much as American progressivism, at its best, takes that to be the essential principle of our politics. They both stray from that principle at their worst. And I think that what you find in this kind of reactionism is a kind of conservatism at its worst. It's also ultimately, it seems to me, hostile to our existing institutions. It's fundamentally antinomian in a way that is very, that would be very hostile and unfamiliar to a kind of Burkean conservatism. But you know, these threads, these strands have intertwined on the right for a long time. They're not new, and I think it's always incumbent on people on the right to push against that darker side of the contemporary right. And this is a time when the American right is not doing a good enough job of pushing against them, to put it mildly.
And the alt-right seems to go against Burke's very elitist tendencies also, right? Because Burke would seem to lead to the more elitist strain of the Republican Party.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that's right. I mean, or at least to a confidence in institutions and in elites. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Burke is not a populist. He's not a kind of burn it down conservative, you know, in the least. He may go to excess in this direction, but it's certainly the direction he goes in.
So as a left-wing person reading your book, I actually got a lot out of it. Some of the lessons that I learned from your book is that many people do not want radical change because they fear things that are new, and that they're attached to tradition and habits. And also the idea that, I mean, Burke's idea that rationality does not decide a lot of things. Rationality only plays a small part in people's decision-making or political positions. So these ideas are very strange to me because I'm very Paine-like, but they do help me understand some things about the mentality of the other side. So what do you think we can take away from understanding more about each other? Is it that strategists are better able to sort of manipulate the other side? Is it that does it create more tolerance, less tolerance? Is it that there's an unbridgeable divide? Because even in psychology these days, there have been studies about fundamental differences between the brains of left-wing people and right-wing people. Just different parts of the brain light up, you know, I don't know. So what do you think?
Well, look, I think that the one thing you get from seeing that debate in one of its earliest iterations is that these are ultimately both liberal views. They both are impatient with liberalism in different ways, but they both also embody a kind of liberalism. And you know, our politics, for all that it is polarized and intensely divided, is actually a fairly moderate politics. In American political life, we're not arguing about extreme alternatives. It's not a debate between, between communists on the one hand and even radical libertarians on the other hand. It's really not. I mean, our debate is had between the 40-yard lines in a lot of ways. That's part of why it's so intense in a sense, but it is important to recognize that fact enables a great deal of stability and allows us to argue with one another. I also think it's helpful to see that these different forms of liberalism, what I would call conservative liberalism and progressive liberalism, are rooted in some differences about anthropology or about the nature of the human person that are pretty important to understand, where there really is a sense in which conservatives start out thinking that the human person is fallen and broken and needs to be formed by institutions. And progressives do tend to start out thinking that the human person is free and is oppressed by institutions. And so the purpose of politics for that kind of more progressive view is the liberation of the individual. The purpose of politics for a more conservative view is, in a sense, the formation of the individual. And these are very different ways of thinking about the purpose of a political order. The trouble for any of us who want to be involved in politics is that these views are both partially true. I think it's just obvious that they are both partially true. And that means that we have to recognize that people we disagree with, however intensely we disagree with them in politics, are actually making a sensible argument and that are offering something that's ultimately rooted in an idea of how our society could be better. I've worked in politics now for more than 20 years. I've worked for a president, for members of Congress. I think the hardest thing to accept about our political life in this moment is that essentially everybody is well-intentioned. People don't wake up in the morning thinking, how do I abuse this person for the sake of my constituency? That is not what's going on. People really do believe that they are ultimately advancing a set of ideas and policies that would be good for the country. They may be wrong, but that is in fact their intention. And our political culture now makes it very, very hard to believe that, to accept that. More than two parties that are at each other's throats in this moment, I think we have two parties that have each withdrawn into its own isolated chamber to talk about the other. And that means that people walk around with very peculiar views of what people who disagree with them are all about. They're very angry about things that the other party probably is only barely aware of most of the time. And that kind of unhealthy political culture, I think, really could do with a deeper understanding of these different sides of liberalism and why they move people in different ways. I'm not suggesting there could be, a kind of kumbaya moment where we all come together, but I think it would help us see that a political system that's ordered around compelling accommodation between these broadly two ways of thinking can be very constructive and is probably the only way for our society ultimately to endure its own divisions, to live with these differences. And so I'm a great believer in our institutions of accommodation and negotiation and bargaining. These institutions are now in very bad shape, and I think it's worth our while to work on fixing them. So walking away from a study of this kind of debate, I'm left pretty hopeful about what our society can do. But look, this is a moment of intense and bitter division, a lot of irresponsibility, and it requires a resurgence of a sense of both personal and communal responsibility.
Yeah, I agree that we're all trying to be virtuous. We just have different definitions of virtue.
Yeah.
Laurent Dubois has a few words to say now. He would like to take the floor.
Thank you so much. I just want to pop on and say thank you so much. When you do a Zoom event, the first part is getting people to the event. And what you all did was to have people stay, which is always, and we had a great audience, great engagement, which is just testament to what a fantastic conversation it was. I think really deep, engaging, inspiring, and I hope the beginning of many more along these lines. And thank you so much, Yuval, for sharing your wisdom and insights with us, and your hopefulness as well, and sense of how we can move into the future of a democracy together. So we really appreciate you both being here, and to all the audience members, we'll hope to see you again in the future as well. So thank you.
Thanks very much.